Okay, sorry about that, everybody. Technology has its ups and its downs. All right. Hopefully it's back online for everybody, or in a second session of it or something. All right. So Joseph told him, Pharaoh, that the dreams were repeated because it's so important. And then finally, Joseph advised Pharaoh that he needed to appoint. And maybe Joseph has in the back of mind, hey, I'm a good candidate. But he doesn't actually say that. Okay, he's not. It doesn't seem like he's saying, pick me, pick me, pick me, or I'm the only one who can do the job. He's just saying, Pharaoh, you need to put someone in charge. This is not a Pharaoh job. Pharaohs sit on the throne and they sort of oversee kingdoms and that's. This is a man of full, administrative responsibility who will make sure that he operates what Pharaoh needs to be done during this 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine. All 14 years need to be managed. So he says officers should be appointed, not just one man. One man is sort of in charge, but he adds to it, Lord, or Pharaoh, you need some infrastructure. You need levels of management, a hierarchy. You need some guy in charge, and then you need officers, because Egypt's a really big territory, and you got lots of people growing grain. One man isn't enough to ensure that the full authority of Pharaoh is being observed when you bring about the regulations that I've advised, collect 20%, 1/5 of all the grain that's produced. So, we need to see it's fully enforced. It's really a tax. It's a grain tax, which is fine. I'm never been a fan of taxes. But in this case, I don't think the people would have survived if Joseph and Pharaoh hadn't exercised the authority to implement the grain tax and everything else they did throughout this process. We'll continue to unpack that a little bit as we go. So the grain tax should then be the taxes that are collected, the grain itself, should be stored in grain houses throughout Egypt and by good stewardship used to keep the people alive during the famine. So just again, you can already picture it, but you got to build a great big storehouse. Jesus talked about, maybe we shouldn't always do that, but in this case we should. Build a storehouse that's going to be able to hold 7 years. So you got to get it started pretty much right away. Start building that storehouse, or maybe you need to build one each year or something like that. I mean, I'm not saying it's only one, but build these storehouses and get it ready, because you're going to have to store for 7 years. And it's going to need to be have these storehouses all throughout Egypt to keep people alive during those famine years. Okay, and I think don't all store it in the capital city, Memphis or whatever the capital city is. Then you're going to have people traveling for hundreds of miles to get grain and then carry hundreds of miles back home. Build them where the people are. Build storehouses where the people are. Collect it. You don't have to transport grain all the way back to Memphis and then transport it back when the people need it. Build satellite storehouses throughout the land of Egypt, and that means you got to have people administrating and appointed to the task of making sure the farmers and all who are giving the right tax point, and it's being managed and stored properly within the grain houses. So then these grain taxes, the intention is store it, because the famine is coming. Even if the people don't believe the famine is coming, store it because it is coming. Failure to properly manage these supplies during the 7 years would surely result in the death of many people. That death would be on Pharaoh's hands, his head, if he didn't actually take action. Even today, a lot of political leaders don't really care all that much about the lives of people. But really, this is Pharaoh. If you do it right, people will live. If you do it wrong, at least some, if not many, people will die. That's, what Joseph is trying to communicate, the intensity or the severity of what God has communicated. So Pharaoh was given, I believe, a tremendous responsibility, kind of over at least the world of his day, as much as it would spread through. And he, of course, Joseph tells him, needs to appoint a very trustworthy man to oversee it all and follow God's instructions. Not Joseph's instructions, God's instructions. And so, again, there's this need to appoint someone in charge. Most of us already know who Pharaoh will select, but again, Joseph did not say, and God told me to put me in that position. That would have been a lie, because I don't think that's what God told him. Right? But he tells him, you need to appoint these things. And so he may very well have thought, there's a good possibility he'll send me right back to prison. But he probably still had hope, and he still had those dreams that he had at age 17. And he still, I think, has a great deal of faith in Yahweh. Remember how much he had faith in Yahweh to flee from Potiphar's wife, right? And remember how confident he was when the baker and butler needed an interpretation. God is the interpretation. Give me your dreams, I'll give you an interpretation. He has a man of faith, a man of trust, and there's, I can't say there's no chinks in his armor. We're just not told about any sort of doubts that he had. And so it won't take long. He'll know what his future holds here in a moment. So picking up in verse 37 of chapter 41. So the advice was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of all of his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find such a one as this, a man in whom the Spirit of God is? Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, inasmuch as God has shown you all this, there is no one as discerning and as wise as you. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall be ruled according to your word. Only in regard to the throne will I be greater than you. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I have set you over all the land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh took off his signet ring off his hand and put it on Joseph's hand. And he clothed him in garments of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. And he had him ride in the second chariot which he had, and they cried out before him, bow the knee. So he set him over all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh also said to Joseph, I'm Pharaoh, and without your consent, no man may lift a hand or a foot in all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphnath Paneah, and he gave him as a wife Asenath, the daughter of Pharoah, priest of On. So Joseph went out over all the land of Egypt. And Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went throughout all the land of Egypt. So here's Joseph's ascension to power. Okay, he's appointed as second in command. One time and one time only, as we'll see here later on, he'll be called the governor, okay, which to us means something. In that time, it means maybe something slightly different. He's second in command. Pharaoh basically saying, I have abdicated all of my responsibilities except where I sit on the throne. You're in charge of the whole place, okay? And so, we'll see that. So the advice, of course, given to Pharaoh by Joseph was accepted, not just by Pharaoh, but by all his servants. Yeah, that's a great thing to do. If this 7 years of famine followed by 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine is actually coming, Joseph has given very, very wise counsel to Pharaoh. So Pharaoh addressed his servants, and he asked, is there anyone better than any man better to take this role, to be appointed to the task with the qualification of having the Spirit of God in him? And of course, no one could claim to have the Spirit of God in him. So if any of his servants wanted that role, Pharaoh kind of disqualified them because Pharaoh himself was wanting a man filled with the Spirit of God. Now, of course, no response is recorded by the servants, and it's not likely that Pharaoh was actually seeking a response from them. He made his mind up, right? So he's basically saying, servants, you'll agree with me, Joseph's the man for the job. Okay, rather than actually asking a dozen or 100 men surrounding him. Anybody else think Joseph's not the right guy? Anybody? No, I think he's just saying, Joseph's my guy. Get on board with my decision. He's now your boss. Okay. So Pharaoh acknowledged that there was no one as discerning, as wise as Joseph, especially since it was God, of course, who revealed the interpretation and the meaning of the dreams to him. And Pharaoh promotes Joseph. He's now in charge over everything in his house. That's the third time that Joseph has been appointed the ruler of an important man's house in the kingdom of Egypt. Okay, this time, the highest person in the land, the Pharaoh. So he says that in regards to Joseph's responsibilities and power and authority, no one except Pharaoh could possibly have more authority than him. And it's only in the manners of the throne, what the king and the king alone can do. He can't give that to Joseph. He's not making him Pharaoh. He's making him number 2 with all the authority of Pharaoh, with the exception of himself. So in the span of a few hours, of course, we can just notice here that Joseph went from being in a dungeon and having all authority to rule over Egypt. It's the most powerful nation of its day. Okay, I mean, like literally going from a prison cell and dirty clothes and very, very little to be hopeful about, and suddenly somebody comes and knocks on the prison door and says, "I need Joseph. We got to get him to Pharaoh, get him cleaned up, and get him to Pharaoh." Maybe a few hours. He's suddenly number 2 most powerful man in Egypt. And we're going to see throughout this relationship, Pharaoh always defers to Joseph. He never says, "Hey, Joseph, I'm going to overrule you this time." Never happens. He always defers to Joseph, always honors Joseph, always seems to just have that, you call it loving, at least respect for Joseph throughout their entire tenure as number 1 and number 2 in charge of the kingdom. All right. Yeah, okay. So Pharaoh then gave Joseph another change of clothing. That first one he got out of prison was okay to stand before Pharaoh as a lowly servant, interpreter of dreams. But he now gives him a change of clothing, second time in one day. He gets another change of clothing, this time to fine linen, like the best Egyptian linen money would ever have. Okay? And he put this gold chain around his neck, and he shows that Joseph was a man. This is to show the people of Egypt. Don't think of him as a former prisoner. Think of him as a rich man of means and wealth and power, and he's due all respect and your full attention. He's going to come before you. He is absolutely in charge. Okay, so if you think of a Pharaoh having wealth and richness, and got to project yourself to your subjects as someone who has power and authority and class and all that kind of stuff. Well, Joseph needs pretty much the same kind of appearance before the people of Egypt. So he gets a gold chain around his neck. I'm guessing that might be just more than a little gold chain. This might be something very royal, very official that Joseph is wearing. This is to communicate again that he has power over the people, and he has all of Pharaoh's authority with him. Now, we talked about this even last week, but with Judah. But Pharaoh then transfers his signet ring from his own hand, and I'm sure he just wore all the time. I need this, it's in my control. This is what tells everybody that this decision has come from Pharaoh. He transfers it to Joseph's hand, an act that demonstrates with absolute certainty that Joseph now had all power and all authority, the same as the king has, to make and enforce all laws within the land. Okay. Pharaoh said, that's not my job anymore, that's your job, Joseph. So Pharaoh then had Joseph ride in his second chariot. Now, he kept the throne and he kept his own first chariot for himself, but he had his second reserved chariot he gives to Joseph. And he has his own servants going out before Joseph's chariot and saying to all the people to cry out before them, "Bow your knee in honor and reverence to this newly appointed leader. This is now your governor. He's not Pharaoh, but he's in charge of everything." And they're screaming out, "Bow the knee, bow the knee, bow the knee," so that everybody, and wherever Joseph went, and it seems he went all through the entire land of Egypt, main population centers or whatever, he goes all through riding in this second chariot, and everyone in Egypt is beginning to understand there is now a man in charge, and his name is Joseph. Okay. So in a final demonstration of Pharaoh's commitment to transfer all authority to Joseph, he stated that no man in all of Egypt may lift a hand or a foot in opposition to whatever Joseph says or commands people to do. So it was just like, do we get it? I think that's the ascent. How much do I have to do to show you, Joseph, and show the people of Egypt, this man is in charge? He's not a Pharaoh, but he is in charge. So if Pharaoh had the authority to send a man to prison or to hang him at his command, then Joseph now has that same authority. Not just to collect grain and tax and make some administrative decisions. If Pharaoh could send the baker and the butler to prison, Joseph can send the baker and the butler to prison. And if he determines that the baker had some offense, then chop off his head, hang him on a tree, let the birds eat him. Joseph has the same authority. He doesn't need to check with Pharaoh, can I do this? He's got the full authority that Pharaoh had. Yeah. Sure, yeah, if he wanted revenge, but I don't think Joseph is a man of great, revenge or harboring hatred in his heart per se. We're going to see when he meets with his brothers that he's got a lesson for them to learn, but he's not harboring bad feelings towards them, as we see all the way through. So, yeah, she may have been. Who's in charge of Egypt? Yeah. Could have been something to be lose a little sleep over. Yeah, good point. That's something I had never considered, so that's great. So Pharaoh gave Joseph an Egyptian name. It should say an, not an and. Joseph an Egyptian name, in addition to his own, Zaphnath Paaneah, and God, that means in Egyptian, God speaks and he lives, right? God is real, God lives, and he speaks. And Joseph is a man through whom God does speak. He gives him an Egyptian wife. So now we know, like we talked about, Judah has a Canaanite wife and all that. Well, now we know that Joseph has an Egyptian wife, not a Hebrew. And her name is Asenath, the daughter of Pharoah. Some people tried to put that like Potiphar's daughter Potiphar, but Potiphar was a captain of the guard, and this man is a priest of On, so it's very, very unlikely that it has any relationship. Names just kind of sound very familiar at times. Okay. So he gets a wife. And we're then told the time gap between when he was having dreams, hated by his brothers, sold and dumped in a pit, and how long he spent in Potiphar's house, in prison, up until he meets with Pharaoh. He's now 30 years old. So since he was 17 when he told his dreams, he spent 2 years waiting for the butler to remember him. So therefore he spent 11 years serving either Potiphar or in prison. The division between those two roles, I don't know, right? We just know that he very quickly rose to power in Potiphar's house. He then gets falsely accused by Potiphar's wife, and he ends up in prison over the course of 11 years, 2 of which for sure were in prison, probably at least 3 or 4, given the fact that he rose to power in the prison, and then suddenly the baker and the butler appear. So anyway, I don't know how you sort that out or if it makes any difference, but 11 years between Potiphar and prison before the butler and the baker arrive. So Joseph then went throughout all the land to observe the land. He hasn't seen Egypt. He's in charge of a land he's never seen. He's in charge of cities he probably may not know the names of. He's in charge of, local authorities he's never met. He's going out and he's meeting all and seeing all the land of Egypt. I think it'd be pretty difficult to rule, even from the capital city of Egypt, and going, I have no idea what my territory looks like. I have no idea where the dangers of people and marauders coming in this gate or that gate. And he's going out to observe the land. He's got a lot of responsibilities. He needs to go out through all the land. Plus, anyone who has any level of authority, direct reports, he needs to connect with them and let them know, first off, I'm in charge. Secondly, there's 7 years of plenty coming, and this is what we're going to do during those 7 years. So he goes throughout all the land to establish his authority, to communicate the plan that he's been appointed to oversee, and who knows what else. Is Joseph just enthralled with everybody bowing down and worshiping, or at least giving honor to him? Maybe not worshiping him, but giving honor to him? I don't know. But he's certainly making sure he gets out the land, and being someone who never was in Egypt until the Midianite traders brought him in, and they may not even have good visibility from the ox cart or whatever to get there. He has just generally no idea what Egypt looks like. So he goes out, he meets people, he sees the land, he starts his role as governor, as he's later described. It doesn't say in Scripture. Most people believe he's probably younger than Joseph. Okay, most commentators that I've read say they think that he's a man. He is a young man looking for a mentor, looking for someone with experience to guide him and lead him through his decision-making process. How they relate that, I can't give you good historical information on it. There's so many speculations about which Pharaoh was in charge at which time and how it corresponds to the biblical stories or biblical narratives. But I will say most of the commentaries I've read on Genesis believe that Pharaoh may have been 10 years or more younger than Joseph. So, okay, we'll take a break and we will come back. Okay, here we go. All right, let's pick up in verse 47 of chapter 41. So here we're going to jump into the plentiful years. So now in the 7 plentiful years, the ground broke forth abundantly. So he gathered up all the food of the 7 years which were in the land of Egypt, and laid up the food in the cities. And he laid up in every city the food of the fields which surrounded them. So Joseph gathered very much grain, as of the sand of the sea, until he stopped counting, for it was immeasurable. And to Joseph were born 2 sons, born before the years of famine came, whom Asenath, the daughter of Pharoah, priest of On, bore to him. Joseph gathered very much grain as the sand of the sea until he stopped counting, for it was immeasurable. Oh, I don't know. I guess I didn't actually click that over. I thought I did. So Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for God had made, meaning God has made me forget all my toil and my father's house. And the name of the second he called Ephraim, for God has caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. So not a whole lot to cover here, but a few things. So during the next 7 years, the ground brought forth abundantly, literally overflowing with handfuls. Okay, that's the word that's actually used there is kind of overflowing with handfuls. It's not 7 normal years. Okay, I mean, I think that's the point where we're trying to interpret here. This is not 7 normal years, like 1 grain on top of a head is normal, 7 on top of a single stalk is abnormal. This is abnormally production of very fruitful, very bountiful, kind of productions for the field, the grains that are occurring in the field. So Joseph's management of these 7 years of plenty was of the highest level of competence. It doesn't say that in the text, but it's certainly implied that he had to be a very competent administrator of every grain that was produced, even though it was coming forth by the handfuls in overabundance. He couldn't even count it, but just because he can't count it doesn't mean, well, you just stop. He still had to have that tax. He still had to make sure there was plenty of storehouse and full control over the whole land, because he had a big responsibility ahead of him in 7 years. All right, so Joseph's grain storehouse strategy ensured that the people had enough during the 7 years of plenty, while also ensuring the storehouses of grain were sufficient to cover, of course, the 7 years of famine. So he has to build buildings or build structures, put it in there, and make sure nobody is, pilfering the storehouses during the years, because you're going to need it in the future. So very responsible level of sort of management over everything that's occurring. So the food was stored in the cities of Egypt so that, as I said, the supplies would be readily available when the people needed them without having to travel some great distance, either to deliver the grain in this plentiful years or to pull grain from the storehouses in the years of famine. Now, Scripture describes the amount of grain collected in 7 years as being as innumerable, or I think you probably should say, as the sand of the sea. It's really euphemistically. It's not saying there's more grain than the sand by the seashore. It's saying you can't count the grains of sand by the seashore. You're not going to be able to count the amount of abundance of productivity of the land under Joseph's administration during those 7 years. So ultimately, even Joseph has to stop counting or inventorying. He's done, for a while there, I don't know how long, 3 years, 5 years, I don't know how long, Joseph's sort of taking inventories. Got a full storehouse over here in Thebes, and you got a full storehouse over here, all that. And he's going, I built 7 more storehouses. And eventually just goes, if grain comes in and you don't have enough room to store it, just build another storehouse. I mean, it's one of those kind of things, right? He's just kind of stopped taking inventory. It's just not productive use of his time to try and inventory everything that God has blessed the land with during those 7 years. So while he was busy and he was a busy and faithful administrator, in the middle of all this, he's able to have 2 sons during these years of plenty. Probably better to have them in the years of plenty than the years of famine. Probably much, much busier in the years of famine than the plenty, because the people are in an uproar, right? And Joseph is a busy man. Not that, he couldn't have time with his wife, but anyway, as we saw, 2 sons are born. These will become very important here in another 6 chapters, 7 chapters or so. Manasseh is the firstborn, and we won't forget that when Jacob adopts and blesses these two men, and blesses them in an opposite direction than Joseph wanted. That's down the road. Manasseh means making forgetful, because he was no longer in toil with his brothers 13 years ago, right? It's all done, it's all gone, and I think this is a first statement we really see. Joseph's like, what they did to me, they should have never done, but God used that for a purpose that I recognize that was just God's will being poured out in my life. Okay, so it made me forget them. I've forgotten my toil. I mean, and sometimes we've speculated, Joseph's in charge of Egypt. Couldn't he have said, hey, Pharaoh, I want to run back home and see my dad? I bet Pharaoh would have said yes, right? But it just wasn't in the plan. He kind of made that life that he once lived with his father in Hebron and in Canaan is just kind of past life. I'm now in Egypt. This is my current life, and it's sort of just all gone at that point. As far as having a remembrance of need, and maybe he's going, this is where God has me, so maybe he even knows they'll come to me eventually. Okay, maybe that insight has already sprung upon him. I don't know. So Ephraim means fruitfulness, because God has caused him to be fruitful. Boy, that's kind of an understatement. Everything this man has done all throughout entire life has been fruitful, has been blessed, has been seen the hand of the Lord in his life. And so even though he's sold into slavery in the land of Egypt, I got a fruitful life, right? Those 13 years of being wrongfully accused and imprisoned and should never have been in a servant position, even the highest servant position in anybody's household, yeah, I'm fruitful. God multiplies, God blesses, I'll just go where God called me to go. These 7 years of plenty then are now going to be followed by 7 years of famine. So the 7 years of plenty which were in the land ended, and the 7 years of famine began to come. So they were so the 7 years is not much to report. High level of abundance and productivity of the land, and Joseph being a very competent, very faithful administrator as God and Pharaoh have appointed him to be. Not much else to say. 7 years of famine are starting, and there's going to be a lot of things that happen during these 7 years. He's going to be reunited with his family. He's going to be reunited with his father. Lots of things are going to happen during this 7 years of famine. So we're just going to start scratching the surface of that here. And the 7 years of famine began to come, and Joseph had said or interpreted of Pharaoh's dreams. And the famine was in all the lands, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread or food, right? And so the famine is in far more territory than just Egypt. So when all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. Then Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, go to Joseph. Whatever he says to you, do. Again, reinforcing his position of giving Joseph authority. So the famine was all over the face of the earth, and Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians. And the famine became severe in the land of Egypt. So all the countries came to Joseph in Egypt to buy grain, because the famine was severe in all the lands. I think there's quite a few things here to kind of sort through to hopefully gain the proper understanding of what's going on here. So the interpretation of Pharaoh's dreams as given to Joseph was fully proven to this point. There's been 7 years of famine, 7 years of plenty, and a full abundance, just as the dreams indicated. And now we've started the first of the 7 years of famine, and we're seeing that everything that Joseph has been told by God is, in fact, fully coming true. 7 years of unprecedented abundance, 7 years were complete, and now we have the famine starting. So despite the famine, Egypt had a full supply of grain controlled by Joseph, by those taxes that he imposed, and been stored in those storehouses that I'm sure didn't exist until Joseph built them. So when the famine personally hit the Egyptian people, right, directly, right now, we don't have bread. We've run out of our own. Whatever we stored up in our house, we've run out of it. I don't know if all the people knew that 7 years of famine were coming, and were coming after these 7 years of plenty. I mean, they might have been able to store up their own. It sounds like they had just goops and gobs of productivity, and they were giving Joseph 20%. But if it's an overproduction, they may have been able to store their own, but they didn't. Seems that most people didn't. So when the famine, they have this need for bread. They cry out to Pharaoh, but Pharaoh, of course, defers back to Joseph. So he responds to the people that they need to go to Joseph, and whatever he tells you, you do it, because that's what's going to keep you alive. And I believe Pharaoh at this moment was likely very grateful that Joseph was his number 2 ruler in the land. Okay, the people are clamoring for food. Joseph had this great plan to feed the people. I am so glad that I have put this man in charge. I don't have to worry. The people won't die. Joseph's got a plan. I'm so happy. It's easy to rule when everybody's fat and happy and full of money in their pockets, right? Now it's tough times. Now the economic challenges. Now the actual life challenges are coming on him. I'm so glad he's the guy that they're going to. I trust him. In my mind, I see him as being like, I'm glad I don't have to tell people to come to me and give me answers. Just go to Joseph. I'll sit on the throne and do throne things. So the famine was a massive problem. Do not understate or undersell what's going on here. The famine, even in year 1, was a massive problem. But he could send everyone to Joseph, I believe, with great confidence that everything would happen and be well managed. Now, Scripture records that the famine was all over the face of all the earth. Now, of course, all means all. Of course, all doesn't always mean like every single possible thing. Right? All means all, but it doesn't always mean like there's no exception, there's no way of escape. All means, if you think about it, it probably is included. Is kind of that sense process. However, earth, we translate earth, and if I say earth to you, you think this globe in our solar system, right? But earth can mean territory or country, or it might mean the whole earth, or the whole population of the earth. So there's lots of range of meanings of that term, eretz in Hebrew. So it can mean very specific, or it can mean very, very broad, or whole, or all. So to me, most likely the famine conditions affected every nation that was in reasonable traveling distance to Egypt. Okay, think about that for a little bit. Reasonable traveling distance to Egypt. God was using the famine to accomplish his purpose in the lives of Joseph and Jacob and the 12 or the 11 other sons of Jacob himself. This famine was about that family and that region, getting them out of Canaan and into Egypt. Okay? And I don't believe there's any biblical indication that the famine that we're discussing here wiped out civilizations and populations that were far too far away from Egypt to travel back to Egypt and get grain. Okay, so I don't know that all means all. I think all means everything that Joseph could ever even have envisioned, these nations would come back and buy grain from him. If there's something 2,000 miles away or 6,000 miles away, I don't think that was the point of the famine. I don't think it included them. I can't even begin to tell you where populations were 2,000 years before Christ, how far away, because it's not in the Bible. That's not the focus of the Scriptures. Okay, so all means all. But it may not mean if there were Native Americans living in America at that time. I don't think they were quite here that early. But don't think that it had to include them, and they must have died because they didn't travel all the way back to Egypt. Hopefully that makes sense. So Joseph's management included an understanding, I believe, of good basic supply and demand economics. This is very good stuff. And while I've always been I hate taxes kind of person, right? And don't take from me and give it to somebody else kind of thing. I want to explain to you why I think this is ideal, even more so than probably the first or second or 10th time I read it. I want to try and explain why I think what Joseph had done through the 14 years is really, really, really important and really, really observes great supply and demand economic principles. As Egypt's principal ruler, he's the one who built the storehouses. He commissioned the taxing mechanisms so as to provide for the needed grain for the 7 years. The people weren't doing it for themselves. I don't think that there was this. Well, let's just kind of walk through here. The people of Egypt paid that grain tax, that 20%, that 1/5. But their overabundance here was from the Lord. So at a minimum, paying the tax was no burden to them at all. right? They paid a 20% tax, but God is already overproducing handfuls of grain. So I don't think they were short during their 7 years of plenty. They gave Joseph the extra, and they were fine. In fact, I think, again, they could have probably stored up their own 7 years' worth of bread, grain, but didn't. Sold it, they ate it, they tossed it as spoiled, didn't properly take care of it. I don't think it's a 20% tax that I don't think had any impact on their lives. I don't have any impact. They don't go, oh, I hate this 20% tax. I would have bought a boat, and I would have done this, and I would have done that, whatever, with my overage. No, it was just, they had everything they would have had in any other given year because it was a 20% tax of the overabundance that was being produced. Okay. Now, of course, Joseph could not open the storehouses and let the people take what they wanted in the first year of the famine. If he just said, well, the storehouses are there, guys, go take whatever you want, surely there will be enough for 7 years. I don't think the storehouses would have ever been able to supply all the people with all the grain they needed for the 7 years. People just rampage and take far more than they need, and then they waste it, and they don't respect what's going on here. So I don't think he could have just said, well, it's your grain anyway. You gave it to me. I was storing it for you for 7 years. Come and get what you need. I'll just sit back and wait for the 7 years of famine to end. I think that would have been terrible supply and demand and mob mentality, fear tactic kind of, I'm short and I need something kind of management of the whole process. So I think Joseph had to limit demand by charging the people an appropriate price that would encourage people to buy what they needed, but not more than they needed. Okay? You see how the supply and demand economics are starting to work here. He needed to build supply, and then he needed to manage supply and demand by charging a price that would keep demand at the level that it needed to be managed for the full 7 years. And we'll see that continue to develop even beyond tonight. So because the famine also impacted the surrounding nations, and that all that grain production was really intended by God to also provide for the surrounding nations, but word got around that Egypt was selling grain, and the people from those countries were coming to buy grain from Joseph. Now that's, again, a plan by God. I want to get people traveling to Egypt to buy grain, because there's this family of 10 sons still in Canaan that need to come and buy grain from Joseph. So this is all part of God's plan, and God is using Egypt to bless the world through Joseph's administration. So while the storehouses were spread out to each city, remember I mentioned that earlier. I think he built storehouses in every city. Okay, I believe, I don't have total scriptural support for this, I believe foreigners most likely could only go to buy grain from the capital city and to buy grain directly from Joseph. They couldn't just go to any old city. They had to go to the capital city of Egypt. They had to register as a foreign citizen and come and buy from him directly. So there may have been 100 city storehouses, I don't know. But I think every foreigner had to come all the way through to capital city to Joseph's personal managed storehouse in order to buy grain from him, because he was letting his governors, administrators, whatever you want to call them, manage their own cities. But only Joseph could decide how much grain goes out to foreign nationals. Okay? So he's demanding. So if somebody walks in, hey, I hear there's grain in Egypt. Yes, you have to go follow this path, find the main storehouse. You'll talk to a man there. He'll sell you what you need, right? So this is all part of the plan. And so this guarantees that Joseph is going to individually meet every foreigner who comes to buy from Egypt, and guess that's going to include his brothers. Okay. So jumping into chapter 42. We're going to hit about half of chapter 42 tonight. So when Jacob saw that there was grain in Egypt, Jacob, his father, Jacob, saw that there was grain in Egypt, Jacob said to his sons, "Why do you look at one another?" And he said, "Indeed, I've heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down to that place and buy for us there, that we may live and not die." So Joseph's 10 brothers went down to buy grain in Egypt. But Jacob did not send Joseph's brother Benjamin with his brothers, for he said, lest some calamity befall him. And the sons of Israel went to buy grain among those who journeyed, for the famine was in the land of Canaan. Now Joseph was governor over the land, and it was he who sold to all the people of the land. And Joseph's brothers came and bowed down before him with their faces to the earth. And Joseph saw his brothers, recognized them, but he acted as a stranger to them and spoke roughly to them. Then he said to them, where do you come from? And they said, from the land of Canaan to buy food. So Joseph recognized his brothers, but they did not recognize him. Then Joseph remembered the dreams which he had about them. And he said to them, you are spies, and you have come to see the nakedness of the land. And they said to him, no, my lord, but your servants have come to buy food. We are all one man's son. We are honest men. Your servants are not spies. But he said to them, no, but you have come to see the nakedness of the land. And they said, your servants are 12 brothers, the son of one man in the land of Canaan. And in fact, the youngest is with our father today, and one is no more. But Joseph said to them, it is as I spoke to you, saying, you are spies. In this manner you shall be tested. By the life of Pharaoh, you shall not leave this place unless your youngest brother comes here. Send one of you, and let him bring your brother, and you shall be kept in prison, that the words may be tested to see whether there's any truth in you, or else by the life of Pharaoh, you are surely spies. So he put them all together in prison 3 days. Then Joseph said to them the third day, do this and live, for I fear God. If you are honest men, let one of your brothers be confined to your prison house, but you go and carry grain for the famine to your houses. And bring your youngest brother to me, so your words will be verified, and you shall not die. And they did so. Then they said to one another, we are truly guilty concerning our brother, for we saw the anguish of his soul when he pleaded with us, and we would not hear. Therefore this distress has come upon us. And Reuben answered them, saying, did I not speak to you, saying, do not sin against the boy? And you would not listen? Therefore, behold, his blood is now required of us. But they did not know that Joseph understood them, for he spoke to them through an interpreter. And he turned himself away from them and wept. Then he returned to them again and talked with them, and he took Simeon from them and bound him before their eyes. All right. Good stuff going on here. All right. So for the first time in Jacob's life, we're not talking about Joseph, Jacob's life, he was experiencing the supernatural blessings. He was not, I should say, experiencing the supernatural blessings and provisions of being the heir of Abraham and Isaac. Previously, it seems that whatever Jacob did, the Lord prospered him and provided for him in abundance. We've seen that. Remember, we've been looking at Joseph's life for a really long time, right? We know about his first 40 years in life or whatever, but then he goes to Laban. Of course, everybody in Laban's house recognizes everything Jacob touches is just like, it just gets blessed. And even when he's deceiving and conniving people, it just seems like the Lord keeps blessing him, and Laban recognizes it. And it seems like for the very first time in Jacob's more than 120 years or whatever, he's like, I'm not seeing the Lord's blessing in my life. There's a famine, and it's affecting us. I mean, this man's lived a really long time, and I think this is the first time he's really went, we may not live. My family may not survive this thing. I mean, that's a whole different perspective from a man who, whether he was doing obedience to the Lord or complete wickedness before his brother and Laban, he always had blessings to follow him. Now he's getting something totally different. Should have been a little wake-up call to him. Maybe the Lord's trying to get my attention about what is happening in my life right now. Now, he and his family were at this time, he and his family were in this desperate need. The basic necessities of life, they need them to live. Again, I don't think that has been a part of his existence for that first 100+ years of his life. Then Jacob received the news that Egypt had grain, and he understood that he needed to get grain from Egypt to provide for his family. So before the famine, Jacob's sons may have, we talked about this last week, I think Jacob's sons may have begun to scatter. These 11 boys, begun to scatter. We saw that Judah had already scattered a little bit. They've gone away from home. They may have been separate, okay? So we've seen that. However, I think, I'm more Scott speculating here, to me it seems likely that the famine in the land forced all these wayward sons to come back home to dad. And they were all trying to survive the severe famine conditions. And so whether it was just Judah or all of them, I think God was using the famine to say, go back home, get back under dad's roof. I've got a whole different plan for you. And whether you know it or not, this famine is going to bring about my purposes in all 12 of Jacob's sons' lives. Okay. So I can't prove that. I think that this famine had that effect because we see Judah back home with dad here in the midst of all of this. So Jacob then asked his sons, they're all there with him, okay? He asked them, why they just look around at each other? Why are you staring at each other doing absolutely nothing in the midst of our problem? Okay. You have no plan to deal with our lack of food, our lack of grain. Then he tells them, go to Egypt. It's been reported that there actually is grain in Egypt. Even though there's a famine, I hear that you can get grain from Egypt. And so their sons were then sent to buy grain from Egypt, not to steal it, not to beg for it, to buy it. Okay? And Jacob had wealth, but as we all know, being wealthy without food does not allow survival. Right? You can be a rich man, shipwrecked on an island and go, well, I got all the money in the world, but I can't feed myself. I can't do X, I can't do Y. This is the situation they're in. I think he's still a very wealthy man, but he doesn't have food and he can't provide for his family, and neither can his sons. So Jacob sent his 10 oldest sons to Egypt to buy grain for the family. That's the strategy, that's the plan. He's still dad. He's got to get his sons, even though they're well into adulthood by now, he's got to organize them and get them headed off to Egypt. I'm not sure that all 10 sons needed to go to get grain for the family, but he sends them. Sends all 10 sons. I don't think that's an accident either. Whether Jacob was hearing the voice of the Lord or what, the 10 sons go to Egypt. But Jacob specifically would not allow his youngest son and the last son of his wife Rachel, to Benjamin, to go with them. He wants to protect him as a protective father. Doesn't want any kind of calamity to befall his now last son and now favorite son, since Joseph is, in his mind, still dead. So among those who journeyed, that's that phrase that you see there in the text, among those who journeyed, I believe indicates that there were likely many people traveling to Egypt through Canaan. And so I think Jacob's sitting here somewhere in Canaan, Hebron, or wherever he is at, Shechem, whatever, and he's seeing these caravans of people crossing down, going down to Egypt, right? And so he's like, where are you guys all going? In the midst of our famine. There's grain in Egypt, Jacob, there's grain in Egypt. And so he doesn't have to go to Egypt to find out there's grain in Egypt. He's seen people pass by his territory, gets word, maybe they're coming back with armloads or bagfuls of grain. Where are you getting the grain? Go to Egypt, they're selling it there. Okay, so he sees among those who journey to Egypt is where Jacob seems to get the news that he can get life-providing grain from Egypt. So in this section, Joseph is specifically entitled governor of the land. And it's a really rare term. It's only used like 3 or 4 times in the Old Testament. And this is the only time it's used in the narratives. I think there's a couple of times in some of the poetry books and things like that. So it's a pretty obscure word, but it does indicate a ruling authority over the nation and its people. Again, confirming now 8 years at least into Joseph's being lifted into that position, that the appointment he received is still fully active. He's the governor. what that means. Sometimes I hear people call him the prime minister, maybe the president or whatever, and not the king, but he's in charge. But the word itself in Hebrew that we translate to governor is our best, attempt to explain he's in charge, just not the highest in charge. He's number 2, not number 1. So as governor, Joseph personally sold grain to the people. He's the one selling grain to the people. Again, I don't think this is in every city. He might travel occasionally to the various cities to make sure that things are still going well, but he personally sells grain from his home base, wherever that actually is. So when the 10 brothers arrived, they immediately bowed, and the first thing they do, they see this man dressed in basically royal apparel, highly exalted man. He's in charge, obviously, of the whole thing. They immediately bow their faces down to the ground to Joseph, giving him honor, giving him respect in his position. But they, of course, did not recognize him. It's been 13 years. And the last thing they would have ever expected to see is he's in charge of everything. Now, maybe they should have, but they didn't expect it. So they just simply had no, you're not expecting, so they didn't expect to see their once 17-year-old brother, now 30 years old or 37 years old, and in charge of the land. So Joseph did not, he himself, though, of course, recognizes the 10 brothers. If he recognized one, he probably figures out he can recognize the other. They are all, they also have, 13 years or whatever on top of that, 13 to 20 years on top of all that. But they're not strangers to him. They're known to him. And so he recognizes them. He obviously, as we saw, he speaks to them through an interpreter, but he understands every word they say. But he's using an interpreter, and that helps him keep a distance from his identity from them. So Joseph, he's got a plan, and I tend to think this is not Joseph just being persnickety or having a thing. He's got a plan all the way through the next several chapters. He's got a plan to deal with his brothers and to do what his father needs to do, which is to get into Egypt. And I think he's still fully submitted to God. I think what he's doing here is not going AWOL, not going rogue. I think what he's doing is all part of God leading him in this capacity. So he speaks harshly to them. He doesn't reveal who he is, but this is all part of God. It's not lying. I don't think we can charge him with lying any more than we can charge Jesus with lying, because he didn't tell the 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus that he was Jesus. He speaks of himself in third person, right? Same kind of event here. He's doing something because he's got a plan and a strategy that has to do with being reconciled to his family. So he speaks harshly to them initially and asks them where they're from. Now, he wanted to hear them speak, really, I think, first off, to confirm their identity. Like, you tell me where you're from, you speak to me, and they probably don't know Egyptian, so they're going to speak in their own language. He's got an interpreter there, he can hear them. So he wants final confirmation, these 10 men are my 10 brothers. So then he asks, where you've come from. And of course they reply, they came from Canaan. So with his brothers bowed down to the ground right before him, their faces are in the dirt, okay? Joseph remembers his dreams from 20 years earlier. In fact, it might be 27 years earlier. Now I'm thinking about it, 20 years. 20 years earlier. And how his good news back then was despised by the men who had their faces on the ground. It was good news for all of them back when he was given those dreams. It was good news for all of them. They hated him. They despised him. Now it's being fulfilled, and he's seen it happen right before his eyes. Oh, didn't those sheaves bow down to my sheaf? Didn't the sun, moon, and stars bow down to me? Yeah, right there in front of me. God is fulfilling again his visions, his dreams, his communication, his prophecy being fulfilled right before him. But to continue this slight ruse of the situation, again, he's really finding out the real hearts. All of this is about Joseph finding out the hearts of his once wicked brothers who sold him into slavery and really intended to kill him at first, and then just only changed their mind because they didn't really want his blood on their hands. So Joseph was essentially accusing them in this dialogue here of, I believe, having military intentions of taking over Egypt. Like, you're not brothers, you're military spies, come in to see how vulnerable Egypt is, and you intend to conquer us. I think that's what he's accusing them of. You've come in like like Moses will send out 12 spies, and Joshua sends out 2 spies. You're here to conquer. You're here for military conquest. Is what he's accusing them of. He's not just simply saying, you guys are lowlifes. He's saying, I as the person in charge of Egypt am accusing you of having the worst intentions militarily against my nation. So, of course, the brothers, that's not why they're there, so they deny the charge. We're not spies. We're actually all brothers. We're from the same family history. And so they begin recounting to him how they are actually 10 men of the same father and of one family. That's not a military. They're trying to say, we're explaining why we're not a military band, we're family. Okay? And so they're trying to help Joseph, in their own way, understand that you're falsely accusing us of our intentions. But Joseph rejects their claim of not being spies, and he accuses them again. Then he threatened to imprison them until they could prove their claim to all be brothers. He's basically saying, you have to produce Benjamin in order for me to release you and actually believe your story. I need to be proven that you actually have this 11th brother you claim to have. And they're later going to recount to Jacob. We'll see that next week. They're later going to recount to Jacob. He kept asking us about our brother. How could what were we supposed to lie to this man? And so there's probably a little bit more dialogue going on here than is fully revealed at this moment. But ultimately, he's going to say, you need to bring your brother. Only way you survive this encounter with me, bring Benjamin to me. Okay? And of course, he's got a plan for that, but he's telling them, in their mind, that's the only way you can prove you're not spies. So initially, he demands that they select one brother. It's going to get flopped in a minute, but they're going to select one brother to go back and get Benjamin, while the other 9 remain imprisoned. During that same time, the very same prison that we know Joseph spent well over 2 years in. You guys, why don't you go in the prison I was in? Yeah, it was really fun. Go ahead. First off, I'll send all 10 of you, or I'll let one of you go back. Okay. But then, in the meantime, I don't know, we know exactly what was happening. He told them, I'm going to imprison you, but you can send one guy back to go get Benjamin. But in the meantime, he takes all 10 brothers. Remember, every one of these 10, not Benjamin, was responsible for throwing him in the pit, selling him to Midianites, ultimately everything else that happened to him. He takes all 10 men, puts them in the same prison that he spent several years in at a minimum. And he puts them in there for 3 days until they would presumably let him know which one they were going to select as the man to go back and get their brother Benjamin. Now, given this 3 days, some speculate, I tend to lean this way as well, that's probably the amount of days Joseph spent in the pit until the Midianite traders showed up. So they threw him in the pit for 3 days, is a speculation. And so he's like, well, I'm going to throw you in the dungeon for 3 days. Okay, at a minimum, all 10 of you will endure sort of that same kind of punishment that you made me endure. Can't prove it, but there are a number of commentators who sort of speculate that 3 days isn't by accident. It probably, and of course, it could have some relation to Jesus spending 3 days in the belly of the earth, but it could also mean Joseph, who's really oftentimes a model of Christ, could have spent 3 days in the pit, so he sends 10 brothers to spend 10 days in prison. But then on the 3rd day, Joseph went to his brothers in prison, at the place of the prison, and then he changes his demands. First it was going to be 9 stay, 1 go. Now it's going to be 1 stay, 9 go back. Okay, and it doesn't say why, but I think he just wants to get the 3 days out of the 10 in prison to start with. So Joseph declares, in response to his heart change or his requirement change, he declares he fears God. Now that should have woken them up a little bit, I think. I fear God. And then he says, if you guys are really honest men, You need to select one person to stay with me, and then the other 9 will be able to go back to Canaan, get Benjamin, bring him back. Now, again, we'll see as the story unfolds, they take a really long time because of Jacob's reticence to get back to Egypt. But anyway, he's telling him, go back for, take a couple of weeks or whatever, go back, come back and bring me Benjamin. It's probably much longer than that, maybe a year or close to it. But if they refused, then the brother left behind would be just simply convicted as a spy and die. So the one spy would die. The other 9, of course, were released here. So anyway, that was what he's communicating to his brothers. So then, with Joseph in earshot, but thinking he can't understand them, the brothers speak to one another in their native language, I believe Hebrew, and confess that they were all guilty concerning Joseph, for they saw that he was in, we didn't hear this back in chapter 37, but he was in anguish over what they were doing to him by throwing him in the pit, selling him, intending to kill him, all that. They could see visibly this son of Jacob was in anguish over his brother's, callousness and hatred towards him. In their view, the hardness of their own hearts and their sinful deeds was being repaid by God to them as this governor of Egypt, who they didn't know or recognize, was treating them in this manner. Of course, they were all guilty, some to varying degrees in terms of, both Judah and Reuben were trying to do something different. And of course, the 4 brothers of the 2 concubine wives were sort of at the main perpetrators of things. But they're all guilty. They all went and told Dad that a wild beast had torn Joseph rather than telling him the truth. So Reuben here steps up and he takes an opportunity to chastise his brothers for not listening to him, that they should not sin against Joseph. Now, we didn't see that in chapter 37 either. Now, Reuben did in chapter 37 try to prevent his brothers from killing Joseph, and he succeeded. Don't kill him. There's no profit in that, right? And he does, the text does say he intended, they said, toss him in a pit. And then he himself intended later in the process to go back, pull Joseph out of the pit, take him to Dad, and put him right back where he belonged, but not in front of his brothers. He didn't say to his brothers, "This is sin. Don't do that." He's like, "Hey, just throw him in the pit. We don't want his blood on our hands." And then he had this, I'll sneak back and get Joseph. There was no rebuke of his brothers 20 years earlier. He just said, "Don't kill him. That's probably not a good thing for you guys." So not really caring about Joseph. So thus, Reuben is either exaggerating his innocence in this whole matter, or he really did try to plead for Joseph, but realized they weren't listening to him, so that's when he intended to go back and get Joseph after they refused to let him. So he's either exaggerating, or we didn't get the full story back in chapter 37. So I don't know how to resolve that. It's just those are the 2 ways I can think about why he's saying what he's saying here some 20 years later. So then they say, his blood is now required of us. To me, this is classic retribution theology, which sometimes actually does correlate. God does punish people, and sometimes certain things happen to people as a result of our bad choices and our sinful actions. But that whole retribution theology that's expressed by the theologians, false theologians in Job, is soundly rebuked by God himself in chapter 42 of Job. Right? This whole, Job, you must have done something wrong. All these bad things are happening to you. Well, in this case, something bad is happening to these 10 brothers, and it was a result of their sin, but it doesn't prove retribution theology, because God himself says, don't count on retribution theology to be the right interpretation of events that happen in our lives. Sometimes it's just stuff, and sometimes it has nothing to do. Job was a righteous man, and he didn't deserve to lose his house and his family and all this kind of stuff, but it happened to him, and that's not retribution. That wasn't the reason it happened to him. All right, so that's just throwing that little tidbit in there. So Joseph had been speaking to the Hebrew men through an interpreter, as we saw, but he didn't need one, of course, not for Hebrew. And so he understood all that was said, And he had to, but when he heard what they were saying about the events from 20 years ago, he had to turn away and weep. He's an emotional guy, especially when it comes to his family. I think he's weeping because he really wants to actually be reunited with them. But he knows he has to go through a little bit longer process before he actually can. So he's weeping. He sees maybe a little bit of contrition, a little bit of acknowledgement that they had done wrong to him 20 years earlier. And he's kind of in his heart, I think, I'm again speculating a little bit here, but I think in his heart he's kind of ready to go grab the guys and hug them and say, let's just reconcile. But a few things need to happen first, and in part, he needs to, make sure his brother Benjamin is actually safe from his once wicked brothers. And two, he knows God has a plan to get his father into Egypt, and it's going to require a little bit more finesse in the process. So then after he composes himself from weeping over hearing his speech of his brothers talking about what they did 20 years earlier, he returns and then he selects Simeon to be kept in prison. I'll just talk about a couple things here as we close out. Reuben, of course, was the oldest, and perhaps he was less guilty. Maybe Joseph recognizes, well, my brother Reuben did try to get me out of that pit, did want me to go back to dad. He's not as guilty as the other 9, or some of the other 9. But, of course, he himself, Reuben, was not in good standing with his father Jacob. Remember, Reuben slept with his father's concubine. So that's a problem. So next in line, Simeon is the second oldest born son. And thus if Reuben is disqualified from the family leadership role, Simeon is now the oldest son in charge of the whole thing from his dad's perspective and from Joseph's perspective. So he, in I think Joseph's mind, would be fully responsible for managing the business of the family because Reuben's fall from grace. Therefore, and since Benjamin was home with his father Jacob, the most valuable brother in this mix of 10 men, and of course in terms of inheritance order for his father to consider. From Joseph's evaluation, Joseph's calculations of the situation with Simeon. Like, if dad is going to want to get one of his sons back, it's got to be the heir apparent, Simeon, right? So you don't take Zebulun, you don't take Dan, you don't take, these other guys, you take Simeon because dad wants to give that blessing, that firstborn inheritance that Reuben forfeited. He's going to want to give it to Simeon, at least he thinks. We'll see something different, of course, when it all comes out in the last couple of chapters of Genesis. But I think in Joseph's mind, Simeon's the most valuable player on the board. I'll put Simeon in prison. Dad will want to make sure he gets his son back. Were the other ones? Maybe they're expendable in a tough situation. We're not sure. Okay. So Simeon then suffers in prison for a long time, just as Joseph did, because it take these men a long time to return, which was, I'm sure, certainly longer than Simeon would have ever wanted. But we recognize the reason why it took so long is Jacob, we're going to see, is my son Joseph is dead, Simeon is no more, I can't endure any of my more sons being in danger by going to Egypt. So he holds back until it becomes impossible not to send his sons back to Egypt again. And they have to convince dad, Benjamin has to go or there's no point in going. We'll see that next week. So with that, I will close this out.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.